Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another E-Prime live stream. My name is Devin Struthers. I'm the Product Service and Support Coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we'll be going over E-Prime communications with Biopac. Now, we have a really great live stream today because we have a lot of stuff set up and a lot of stuff really ready for this. This live stream is actually in preparation for Biopac's conference next week. Starting July 24th, Biopac has a T4 conference. It's going to be really cool. We're actually going to be there showing something very similar to this, but if you're interested at all in Biopac communication with E-Prime or would like to learn a little bit more about this field of study, I definitely recommend going to that conference. It's going to be really cool. Plus, I'll be there, so it'll be much better. So to go ahead and get started, what we're going to be doing today is a modified version of the IAPS task. Now, this is something we went over in our other webinar, but we have a few more changes that I've made to it to kind of streamline it a little bit more with Biopac. So before we were kind of sending generic signals from E-Prime to Biopac, now we're going to be sending more specific samples or more specific signals from E-Prime to Biopac. And it's actually going to be based on stimulus that's presented. And I also have a better description of some of the hardware that we're using. We know some people had requested, more of an explanation as to the hardware setup. I did have that chart, but I'm able to actually go in a little bit more depth about that today. So we actually have two cables that we're using today for Biopac. The first one looks a lot like this. So this one is something that we made in-house. All this is this end goes into the Kronos auxiliary I/O port, and this end goes into the DB25 of Biopac. Now this is something that we had made in-house. This part of the cord, this first gray part here, this actually is our Kronos aux I/O cord. And all we did is just took the loose wires here and put it into this DB25. So with this, I get two digital ends to send signals to Biopac and two digital outputs. And we actually have a really good chart that I'm going to show you in a second. So the chart is here. So this is the slide for the conference. This will be some of the things that I show. So specifically, I'm actually talking about this here. So I have two digital outs, my 15 and 16. Now keep in mind that this is zero-based communication when you're talking about digital outs. So I'm going to be communicating through the 15 and 16 pin, but it's going to look in E-Prime like 14 and 15, since it's all zero-based like that. And that's going to line up on the Biopac side as digital I/O 8 and 9. And I'll show you guys how I set that up in Biopac a little later. And then if I want to communicate from Biopac to E-Prime with this cord in particular, I'll be using digital in 16 and 15, which is going to be 14 and 15. And that's digital I/O 5 and 4 on the Biopac end of everything. Now, the other slightly more complex one that we have is going to allow us to have 8 digital outs and 4 digital ins instead of just 2 and 2. So as you can see here, it's a lot more verbose communication, and it actually looks like this. There we go. Give me 1 second to grab this cable here. Now, on the one end of it, it's going to look very similar. It's just a DB25 cord, DB25 serial. But what we did is instead of having kind of a proprietary cord like before, that other little head, we actually just have it going to our Kronos auxiliary I/O port right here. And we just wired them out to the digital inputs. Those are our 4 digital inputs right there. And these are our digital outputs. These are our 8 digital outputs. And the exact pinout of the 8 digital outs and 4 digital ins is on this chart here. So this is how I would send these signals, and this is where Biopac would receive them. And we actually have cable color listed just to keep everything straight in our mind whenever we go to rewire this thing for the conference. But this is actually equipment that's sold separately with Kronos, but it allows for a broader range of communications. So, now that I have those 2 cords, let's go ahead and set up our experiment. Now I'm actually only going to use this one since it's the simplest mode of communication and it's the easiest to show for the webinar. I'm actually just going to use the 2 digital outs. I won't be using any digital ins at this point. So like I had mentioned before, we're going to be making an IAPS task. The IAPS task is going to show 2 image types. One of them is neutral images, and one of them is startling images. The startling images are going to be kept a secret from our participant, Cade, who's returned from our last webinar to help me out with Biopac again. I'm not going to tell him what kind of startling images there are, just so he's completely surprised whenever he sees them. They're snakes.
I'm terrified.
he says he's terrified, so he's ready for this. So let's go ahead and walk through how we're going to build the task. So first off, we're going to start with a blank E-Prime experiment right here. So in our template here, we go ahead and click blank and click OK. And it's going to go ahead and open up a blank version of eStudio. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just the basic structure of an experiment. We're going to welcome participants to the task. We're going to set up a block list for our block of trials, and then we're going to set up a trial list for the individual images, and then we're going to load them in. So the first thing I'm going to do is double click on my session proc here, and I'm going to make a text display object. It's going to be the first thing in my session proc right here. And I'm going to rename this text display object from text display 1 just to welcome. I'm going to hit enter. Now the text I have on here is just going to be very simple. It's going to welcome participants to the experiment, and it's just going to give them some very simple instructions as to how to perform this task. So the first text will be welcome to the experiment. And then you will be shown a series of images. Press 1 if the image is neutral. Press 2 if the image is startling. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and say, press space to continue. So now that I have my text written, the only thing I'm going to do is click on this properties page icon in the upper left-hand corner. And I just want to make it so participants advance from this with a press of the spacebar. So I'm going to click on my duration input tab, change the duration from 1000 to infinite, and I'm going to add a keyboard device here. And I'm going to set my allowable from any to space in curly brackets. That's how you denote pressing the space bar in E-Prime. For more information on that, we do cover that a little bit more in depth in other live streams. I do recommend checking those out. I'm going to change my data logging here from none to time on it only. And again, I explain why in other live streams. If you've been following along, you know exactly why. And I'm going to click apply and OK. So now that I have my welcome screen made, the next thing I'm going to do is make a block list. This block list is going to hold my different blocks of trials. For the IOPS task, I don't necessarily want practice trials. Maybe a few for button mapping if you really want, but I don't want participants to be introduced to the types of images that they're going to be shown very soon. So, I mean, 1 and 2 are very easy to press, so I'm going to just go ahead and make a block list. So to do that, after my welcome object, I'm going to take a list object from the toolbox, and I'm going to drag it and drop it just after welcome. I'm going to right-click on this and rename it from list1 to block list. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to double-click on my block list, and the only change I'm going to make to this is to fill in the procedure with block proc. I'm going to hit enter. It says block proc doesn't exist as a procedure. Would you like to create it? Of course, I'm going to click yes, and I'm going to set the default, make this a default value for newly created levels. I'm going to click no, just because there won't be any levels. And just as a quick background as to why I'm making a block list, this block proc, even though it's not actually being used. If you click on the experiment object and go into the data file tab here, you can see the E-Prime automatically logs data by session, block, and trial like this. This is just the way that E-Prime will naturally log data. So I'm trying to set my experiment up like this so E-Prime's data file gets printed out in a way that E-Prime expects. This actually makes my data much easier to read and much easier to follow later. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and then I'll click on my block proc. Now, if you remember that chart, you know that the next thing that comes after block proc is the trial list. So, or is a trial proc, or that trial level. So I'm going to go ahead and make that. And I'm going to make it the same way I made that block list. And I'm going to do that by taking the list object from the toolbox and dragging and dropping it onto my procedural timeline. I'm going to rename this to trial list just so the name reflects the function. And I'm going to hit enter. Now, unlike the block list, my trial list, if you've been following along with these live streams, my trial list is actually going to hold all of my independent variables for this experiment. It's going to hold the different images that Kate is going to be shown. It's going to hold the triggers that I'm going to send from E-Prime to Biopac. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on trial list, and the first thing I'm going to do is make a procedure, and this is just going to be called trial proc. I'm going to hit enter, and I am going to make this a default value for newly created levels because I'm going to be making a lot of levels, and they will all point to trial proc, so I want to make this a default value just to make things easier for me. Now, the next attribute that I want to make is I want to make an attribute that holds all of the stimuli that I'm going to show Cade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name here from attribute 1 just to the images, or just I'll call it the image, and click add. Now, my images I'm going to present are in a subfolder. So if you look in here, this is my Biopac webinar folder here. All of the images I want to show is in this subfolder called the images. If I double click on it, these are some of the images. These are obviously the startling ones up here, and then these are the neutral ones down here. It's just pictures of nice scenery. Those are my neutral ones. So, and if you notice, I have them all labeled kind of ambiguously here, just from 100 to 105 and from 200 to 205. They're encoded that way, just so I know that all the 100 type images are startling, all of the 200 type images are the neutral images. So all I need to do, and all I'm going to do right now, is just put the name of the image file in the image attribute, and I'm going to fill in the rest of it later using a method called concatenation, and I'll demonstrate that. But as far as the image is concerned, I just want to put 100 as my first one. After that, I want to make another attribute reference because I want to actually be able to categorize these in my data file. So I maybe want to get at, did Cade respond faster to the startling images than he did the neutral images? What was his RT for these kinds of things? And it'll be much easier to categorize this if I actually have an attribute that does this for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Add Attribute, and I'm going to change the name of attribute 1 just to image type. And image type for my 100 level images is going to be startling. And then the only other thing I need to do is I need to add an attribute, and this is going to be the signal that I send from E-Prime to Biopac. Since I'm sending two types of images, or presenting two types of images, I want to present two types of signals to the participants. And I'm going to be using, and I'll open this back up quickly just so you guys can see. Since I'm going to be using this very simple 2 digital outs, 2 digital ins chord, that one that I had shown earlier, I have two possibilities to send. Back here, I have my digital out pin 15 and digital out pin 16, which again, since they're 0 based, ends up being 14 and 15. This is what I'm going to be sending, or these are where I'm going to be sending signals from. And I want my 14 signal to be my startle signal and my 15 signal to be my neutral signal. That way, in the Biopac data stream, I can see, okay, here's where a neutral stimuli started, here's where a neutral stimuli ended, here's where a startle stimuli started, here's where a startle stimuli ended. So that way I can actually determine, what Cade saw and can line that up with everything that I have in my data stream, so I can actually, time lock all of these things. So this is what's going to inform the pin that I set on the E-Prime side or Chrono side of everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an attribute, and this is just going to be called digital signal. And I'm going to hit enter. Now, since I had mentioned before, I would like pin 15 to be the pin that I send signals to through Biopac whenever a startle type image comes up. I'm going to put 14 in there, again, since it's 0 based. And obviously I'd like to present more than one image, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Level and start filling in my 101 condition. Again, this is startling, and the signal I'm going to send is also a 14. So now I'm going to add a couple more all at the same time. So instead of clicking Add Single and just clicking, or typing all of that in, I just want to do multiple. So I will do 8 of those. And this one will be 102, then 103, whoops, then 104, and 105. And then those are all going to be image type startling, and the digital signal is going to be exactly the same. So now all I need to do is my 200 level. So I have 200, 201, 202, and I'm going to add another row here, 203, 204, and just one more for 205. And then again, my image type is going to actually just be neutral this time, and my digital signal instead of 14 is going to be 15. I'm just going to take this and drag those down. And that's actually all I need here. So I have my image that I'm going to be displaying to participants, the type of image for data analysis later, and the digital signal. So this list object's actually doing quite a lot. It's handling all of the independent variables, so everything that I'm changing here. It's handling the exact signal that I'm sending, and it's handling something for data analysis later. This is really how you use list objects to kind of compound everything and make everything really, really simple and easy in E-Prime. The only thing I think I need to change about this list object is this sequential selection. Right now, it's just going to run through all of my startling images and then all of my neutral images. And after a while, startling images stop becoming startling if you see them one after another, after another, after another. So I'm actually going to change this from sequential to random. So to do that, I click on this properties page icon at the top, click on the selection right here, and I'm going to change order from sequential to random. I'm going to click apply and OK. So now I have my 12 samples. These are all going to be selected with random selection. So now I just need to make the actual bulk of my trials. So I'm going to close this window here. I'm going to click close all. I'm going to open up the trial proc here because I want to actually make the trials for my experiment. So I'm going to take a text display object and I'm going to drag and drop it as the first object in my trial procedure. And I'm going to rename this to fixation. And hit enter. Now, I typically add fixations to my experiments if you've been following along with these live streams, just so participants' eyes have somewhere to focus on the center of the screen, because that's where my stimuli is going to be presented. This isn't necessary, the fixation, I just personally like it. So the fixation is literally just going to be a plus sign in the center of the screen. So I hit plus, it appears in the center of the screen. Again, it's going to look like it appears at the top for design time, but if I take a look at my properties here and look at my align horizontal and align vertical properties, you're going to notice that it says center and center because it will end up in the center of the screen. And you know what, I'm going to change the duration of my fixation object from 1000 to 500 milliseconds since it doesn't need to show up for very long. And I'm going to change data logging from none to time audit only, just like my welcome object. And click apply and OK. So since I'm just presenting images to participants, I have a couple options for this next object that I add. I could add an image display because the purpose of this is just to display images, but I think I'm actually going to add a slide object. It actually doesn't matter which one I present since I'm only presenting images. The most efficient method would be to present the text display object, but I do like demonstrating the slide object because it has a lot of the new features and new functions in E-Prime. Or E-Prime 3. So I'm going to take the slide object and I'm going to add it just after fixation, and I'm going to rename it from slide 1 to stimuli. I'm going to hit enter here. I'm going to double click on it to open it up in the workspace, and since I'm presenting images, I would like a slide image sub-object to appear. I'm going to hit just click anywhere to have it appear in the screen, and I'm going to adjust all of its properties in a second. Now, there are a couple of properties I'm going to have to mention about this, specifically in relation to the slide image sub-object and how it's presented on a slide object. But the first one I want to change this file name. So in order to find images in E-Prime, there are kind of two methods you can use to go about this. The first one is clicking on this folder icon here, and I could navigate to wherever I have my Biopac webinar and then the images, and then I could click on an image individually, and what that's going to do is that's going to print out the entire path of the images starting with my C drive. And this is good for presenting exactly one image, and if I actually click apply, you're going to and if E-Prime can find that image, it's going to actually see that image in there. And the reason E-Prime can't see my image right now is because I haven't saved the experiment yet. So I'm going to go ahead and save real quick so we can actually see that image. So I'm going to click Save As, and I'm just going to save this into my Biopac webinar, and this is just going to be called Biopac webinar. There we go. So now if I go into here, and I click on one of my images here and click apply and OK, you can actually see it show up here. This is a really great method for presenting these images one at a time to participants, but I only have one stimuli, and if you notice on my try list, I kind of walk through all of the stimuli in that list object. So I want to make an attribute reference to the images attribute that I made. If at any point you are confused as to whether, or not confused, but you would like to know which one of your which one of your attributes you need to use or what your attribute might be called, in the Experiment Explorer here, we have a tab at the bottom called Attributes. If you click on the tab here, it's actually going to show you all of the attributes that are set in your experiment, and that's going to be really helpful for when you're in design time like this. So I'm actually going to change this. Now if you look, before I had the full path from the C drive to my 202.jpg image. Now I only have the images / and then the name of the image with .jpg or its file extension at the end. This is actually really helpful for editing this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the 202 in here, and instead of 202, I'm going to make an attribute reference to that attribute I made on my trial list called the image. So now whenever this resolves, it's going to say the images, which is that subfolder that I have that contains all of my images, / and then the actual image, so that 101, 102, 201, 202, those kinds of things. It'll resolve that, and then it'll append .jpg at the end. And it's going to do that to make a full reference or a full pathway to my images. So if I click apply and OK, you're going to see that that singular image that I had now went away, and it's replaced with this image here. Now, this is good, but there's something potentially problematic about this. If you look here, my images are only confined to being presented in this very small area. But the images that I have, if you actually look at their properties, they're very different sizes. So if I go to the properties of this image, for example, in details, you're going to see that this one is 375 by 250 pixels, and this one here, if I go into its details, this one is 513 by 289 pixels. So those are very different image sizes, and what's going to happen is if I limit my image display to only this very little box, there might be some images that only display a part of it in the center of it, and I don't get to see the full image. And that's not really going to start okay, and that's kind of the point of this experiment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to resize this image. This is going to be step 1. I want to make it the size that I want every image to appear, and I would like a bit of a border around the image, so I'm going to keep some of the white slide border around this, but make the image relatively this size. Now the other property I want to change then is this stretch property. Now depending on the resolution at which this is running, the stretch property is either going to make things look really blocky or make it look really good, and that's all dependent on the resolution at which you're running this, and it's also entirely dependent on the image that you're using. So I'm going to change stretch property here from no to yes, and then I need to look at the stretch mode property. Now stretch mode, if I stretch both, is going to stretch along both the X and the Y axis, and it'll kind of act like me. It'll act like me doing this. If this is the original size of my image, it's like taking the little cursor in the corner and just stretching it this way. You also have the option to specify to stretch it either left, right, or up, down. Those are kind of circumstantial, or they're more circumstantial. If you find that an image looks best when it's stretched horizontally but not vertically, we recommend that. But I kind of want all my images to be stretched in a very uniform way. So I'm going to keep it that way, and I'm going to click apply and OK. So I need to add a few more properties to this object because, if you remember, the participant has to press either 1 or 2, depending on if it's a startling or a neutral image. So I'm actually going to click on the properties page icon up here, click on the duration input tab. I'm going to change my duration to infinite. You know what, I'll change my duration to 3000. That way there's a possibility that this object times out. I'm going to change my data logging to standard because I'm going to be collecting both responses and timing related data here. And I'm going to add a keyboard input mask since Kate will be responding using the keyboard. I'm going to change my allowable from any to 1 and 2 on the keyboard, and my correct answer is going to be nothing for this case. There is no correct answer. So if it is startling, Kate doesn't have to respond that it is. This is entirely subjective. So I'm going to click apply and OK. All right, so now that I have my structure down to the stimuli, I'm going to click save quickly. Now that I have my structure down to the stimuli, the next thing I want to do is just to add an intertrial interval, or ITI. And that's literally just going to be the screen going blank for 500 milliseconds, so very quickly. So I'm going to take my text display object and I'm going to drag it just after my stimuli, and I am going to change that from text display 1 to ITI. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to double click on this just to open it so I can see it, and it's going to remain blank. I just want the screen to be blank for a little while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my duration input tab, and I'm going to change it from 1000 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds, and change data logging to time audit only. Click apply and OK. And that's the basic structure of my experiment. I have a fixation, a stimuli, and an intertrial interval. The only thing I really need to add now is a goodbye slide, just to, thank people for staring at my startling images of snakes the entire time. So I'm going to click on window here. I'm going to close all, because I like them all to close. I'm going to click on my session proc because the goodbye screen needs to be the very last thing that appears. And I'm going to add a text display to just after my block list. Text display is going to be called goodbye. And just a quick message thanking participants for their participation. So, thank you very much for your participation. Please let the researcher know that you are finished. All right. And that's all we need. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now, if you've been following along, you realize we're not sending signals yet. There's nothing in here that's actually sending signals to Biopac, and that's kind of the important part of this. So I'm going to do that, or I'm doing that on purpose just to kind of do it separately to call out how these objects work together. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a Chronos device to my experiment. And I can do that by clicking Devices, clicking Add, and clicking Chronos. That will allow Chronos to appear in my list of devices. Now, nothing really needs to be changed as far as Chronos is concerned, but I do want to bring up specifically this digital out, because that's how we'll be communicating today. Now, if you take a look here, this is experiment start and experiment end. These allow you to set different values on each of the different pins of Chronos's digital out and digital in at the start of the experiment and at the end of the experiment. Now, I'm going to keep these at 0 here because I want everything to end up being low. So I want all of my pins, instead of being active high, to be active low when my experiment starts, and to reset them all to active low when my experiment ends. That way I know that everything's all ready to send signals at the end, and there's not any extra values being sent, or everything be ready to send at the beginning, and not extra values at the end of the experiment as well. But if I have, let's say, Biopac or another kind of signal or another kind of software or hardware that I'm communicating with like a signal at the start of the experiment, I can actually do that by changing whatever pin I want to send information to from 0 to 1 at the onset of the experiment, and then setting them back to 0 at the end. But for now, I'm going to keep them all at 0. I'm going to click Apply and OK. And I'm going to keep Chronos on there, and that's the only change I need to make to my experiment object. Now, what I want to do as far as signals are concerned is I would like a signal to be sent at the onset of my stimulus object and then at the offset of the stimulus object. So when the stimulus object appears on the screen, I would like a signal to be sent to Biopac, and I would like a signal to be sent to Biopac whenever it leaves the screen. That way in my Biopac data, I kind of get that information as to how long it was on the screen. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this in E-Prime, but there's really only a couple of ways that are really going to be good. And the way that we definitely recommend is the dot onset time of one object and the object immediately after it. Now, I say that because basically, if you use the offset time for a stimulus as your offset trigger, depending on what your pre-release is, that offset time could actually end up being the same as the onset time. Let me show you how that works. If I go to my duration input tab here, my duration for the stimuli object is 3000 milliseconds, and pre-release is set to same as duration. Now, internally, what that's doing is it shows the stimuli object on the screen. Then, since pre-release is set to same as duration, it immediately stops processing stimuli in the background and moves on to processing my ITI object afterwards. So it'll start processing that. So technically, the offset time is when it starts processing the ITI in the background, which, since I have pre-release set to same as duration, is going to be the same time as the duration property. Now, generally speaking, that's best. That is best practice for E-Prime because it allows you to load the next object and significantly decreases the dot onset delay value, or the delay in when the ITI object appears on the screen. However, if I'm sending signals at the offset, it's going to look like this stimuli object appeared on the screen for a couple milliseconds and then it was gone. And I mean, a couple milliseconds may even be an exaggeration. It might be 0 or 1 milliseconds. So that's not ideal. So that's why we recommend keeping the signal for the offset. Instead of putting it on the offset of stimuli, we put it on the onset of ITI. Because onset delay isn't variable like the offset is. There isn't going to be a time when the onset doesn't actually reflect when the image appeared on the screen or when that particular object appeared on the screen. And when that next object appears on the screen is consequently the exact same time that the previous object disappeared from the screen. That's why in our logging tab we now have this property called onset to onset time. It is the difference between when this object appeared on the screen and when the next object appeared on the screen, and is going to be the truest sense of duration of that object that you can get in E-Prime. So we're going to actually add our signals in accordance to that onset to onset time. Now to send these signals, we'll be using a feature called task events. Task events allows us to send signals without having to use any script in E-Prime. It's literally just adding 2 what we call events to E-Prime, and that's it. No script, no really anything difficult, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first thing we need to do to stimulus is we need to set the pin from low to high whenever the image appears on the screen. So we'll go to our task events tab here, and we're going to add an event, and that event is obviously stimuli.onsetTime. Now the task is going to be Chronos, because we're going to be sending a signal through Chronos digital out, and our action is going to be Chronos digital out.setBit. Because if you look back at our little chart here in PowerPoint, the bit that I want to set is pin 15. Since it's 0 based, it's going to be 14. So I actually have an attribute that handles all of that. It was called digital signal. So I'll make an attribute reference here in my customs field for digital signal. So that's going to change between 14 and 15, depending on whatever I have here, or depending on the stimulus type. And I'm going to set the data type to integer. So now that I'm using stimulus.onsetTime, I'm using digital out setBit, which takes that pin and sets it from low, or whatever current state it is, to high. And I'll be setting it from low to high on on 14, which ends up being pin 15. And we click apply and OK. So since I'm doing onset to onset time, the next one I need to add is to my ITI. And it's going to be exactly the same. I go to task events, I add a task event for ITI.onsetTime. My task, or the name of the task, is going to be Chronos. And instead of doing setBit this time, I'm going to be doing resetBit. What resetBit is, it takes the current value of the pin and sets it to low. So that way I have in my Biopac data file, I have exactly when that pin was set from high to low. And I have exactly when this object was off the screen. And my custom is going to be digital signal again, because despite the fact that the function is going to be different, I'm setting it from high to low, the signal or the pin that I'm writing to is exactly the same. That's why my custom has to still be digital signal. And I'll change my data type to integer. And I'll click apply and OK. And that's all I need to do. I'm going to go ahead and click save to save this. But that's all I need to do. So I'm actually just going to run this very quickly. I don't have a Chronos attached to this computer. It's actually attached to the test computer that I'm going to run over to in a second. So I'm actually going to uncheck Chronos from my list of devices, and it'll actually consequently get rid of those task events, or it'll make it so it's not editable or not able to be run. But I'm going to run this very quickly just to make sure that it functions correctly, and then I'm going to go over and explain our Biopac setup with CADE hooked up to it. So I'm going to go ahead and run the experiment in windowed mode very quickly, just to make sure it functions correctly. So there's my welcome screen. Neutral image, neutral image, neutral image. Ooh, startling. Equally startling. That one's pretty rough, actually. Also startling. So it looks like it's functioning correctly. Looks like every part of my experiment works fine. That was my fixation. There's my stimuli, and the white screen there is my ITI. Thank you very much for your participation. And then go ahead and click exit. And if I want, I can jump into my EDAT3 file here. just to make sure that my data is being logged correctly. It is right there. So if I go ahead and look at my stimulus RT, this is my reaction time that I just did to all of my stimuli. These are the images that are being presented to participants, sorry, not just one of them. And then here's my image type. So I had 3 neutral, followed by 4 startling, and then 2 neutral, 2 startling, and 1 neutral. So if I wanted to, I could go into my analysis tab. My columns could be my image type. And then my data could be my stimuli.rt. And be stimuli.resp. We'll click run. So generally speaking, participants, or me in that last run, responded almost entirely to the startling images. Sometimes I hit 2 for the neutral images. And for my stimulus RT, it looks like I responded much faster to the neutral stimuli than I did for my startling stimuli. So it's just a quick look at how I would have looked at that data. So let's actually show you how that would integrate with Biopac. So I'm actually going to switch over to Cade here, who is hooked up to the Biopac. Whoops, give me a second. There we go. So there's Cade on the Biopac, and I'll be over in just a second to explain all of the hardware stuff. Alright, so this is the hardware setup for Biopac. As you can see here, we have the MP150, and we actually just have 3 of the modules, or 3 of the important modules hooked up. The first one is this one right here. This is an STP100C. This is actually where the digital signals from Biopac are being input. And then after this, we have these two. We have these 2 at the end. This first one is our respiratory belt, and this second one is our, there we go. We actually moved the microphone quickly, so you might be able to hear me a little better. But this first one's our respiratory belt, and the second one is our GSR module. And as you can see from Cade, he has the respiratory belt on him right now. There you go. And he has the GSR hooked up to his hands there. So I'm just going to demonstrate quickly what we're doing on the Biopac side of things then, to get everything set up in E-Prime, or to get all the signals from E-Prime into here. So if you look here, there we go. So under data acquisition, I have my 2 channels. I have my 2 channels for my analog, actually. So the 2 analog channels are going to be just my respiratory belt and my GSR, so these 2 modules down here. But if I go over to digital, this is actually where my E-Prime signals are going to be coming in, since I'm doing the digital out to Kronos. And you can actually see the digital out is that cable that I showed earlier. It actually comes from Kronos' analog aux-IO port, or digital aux-IO port, and it goes right into Biopac right here to that STP100 that I talked about earlier. And as you can see, since I was using that chart earlier, all of my pins, or everything that I write from Kronos for these 2 digital outs, is actually going to come in through channel 8 and channel 9 in Kronos. Or sorry, in Biopac. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start acquisition here, and then I'm going to start the experiment and have Cade run through it very quickly. Start recording on Biopac. I'm going to start recording on E-Prime, and I'm just going to let Cade go through and run the task.
Is it 2 or okay?
Yeah, it's 1 and 2.
1 and 2. Okay, cool.
There we go.
I'm terrified.
He was clearly terrified.
I'm shaking in my seat.
It's a pretty startling.
Where are the happy thoughts?
There you go. There was a nice one.
I like these. These are good.
Good.
Threw me off.
So we're actually going to go ahead and end this part of the experiment a little early. So Cade, if you can go ahead and click Control-Alt-Shift for me. Control-Alt-Shift is one of the ways to exit out of an E-Prime experiment a little early.
Should I say yes?
Yeah, go ahead and click yes. And hit yes again. So since we already looked at the E-Prime side of what the data file is going to look like, let's go ahead and take a look at the Biopac side of everything. So I'm actually going to stop my acquisition. And I'm just going to back up my recording just a little bit, just to show you guys exactly what we were getting on the Biopac side. Here we go. So I'm going to zoom in on this part here. Whoops. And of course I exit out of it. There we go. So if you can see the way that Biopac sets everything up here, I actually have the top two columns here, the top two leads here are my respiratory belt, and this is the GSR. But the more important ones, the more relevant ones to the webinar are going to be these bottom two ones. So the bottom two are actually going to be my digital in 1 and my digital in 2. So this is 14 and this is 15 in our signals. So here are my starting stimuli, and every time you see a little rise here, that's when the stimuli appeared on the screen for CADE, and every time you see a fall here, that's when it was removed from the screen. So these were my startling stimuli, and down here in this little pink line, these were my neutral stimuli. So as you can see, CADE in this instance got a startling stimuli, got a neutral stimuli, followed by a startling stimuli. And the nice thing is you can actually tell exactly what the onset delay between these two images were, so how long the fixation was on the screen, and basically how long it took them between stimuli by looking at this little gap in between them there. So that's just very quickly how we would set up and then read the analysis from a Biopac integrated E-Prime experiment. So I'm going to hop over to my computer real quickly and we'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Thank you. Yep. All right, welcome back everybody. So first off, thank you very much, Kate, for being a willing participant today. And that's all we have for today's webinar. If you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have about Biopac integration or any other E-Prime topics. So please feel free to give us a shout out there. Please like and subscribe our page. That definitely helps our channel and helps us to do more of these things. And aside from that, have a great day. Thank you guys very much.